911. 3 buttons. The most important phone call most people will ever make. The one you learn in kindergarten, the one that sends firefighters, police, and paramedics. All of them instantly pointed at your address. But here is what nobody mentions in those school safety assemblies. 911 is a two-way street. Yes, you can call for help. You can also call for a decade and a half of federal supervision. 42 pounds of evidence against yourself. Or, in the most spectacular case on today's list, an armed response team aimed at an address you completely invented. Today, 10 real people who picked up the phone, dialed 911, and handed law enforcement everything it needed to permanently rearrange their lives. Documented cases, real transcripts, real sentences, real people who, for reasons that made sense to exactly one person at the time, decided the call to make was 911. Welcome to the only emergency line in the world where sometimes the emergency is you. The wrong address. 2017, Wichita, Kansas. In December of 2017, Tyler Barris was in Los Angeles. The situation he was about to create was in Wichita, Kansas, specifically at a house on West McCormick Street where a man named Andrew Finch lived with his family. Andrew Finch had nothing to do with any of this. He was home. He was watching television. He was completely uninvolved in the online gaming dispute that two other people were having. A dispute over, and this detail matters, $25. Barris called 911. He told the Wichita dispatcher there was a hostage situation at that address. He said people were being held at gunpoint. He said someone had already been shot. He gave details, specific, convincing details. None of them were true. All of them were recorded. Within minutes, Wichita's tactical response was outside the house on West McCormick. Andrew Finch heard the commotion outside. He came to the door to see what was happening. Andrew Finch did not go back inside. Barris was arrested in Los Angeles within 24 hours. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, the first person in American history to receive that specific sentence for that specific type of call. The gaming dispute that started all of this, the thing being contested between two people who were nowhere near Wichita, 20 years for $25. And the man who opened his front door to see what was happening outside his own home? The pocket decision. Scranton, Pennsylvania. Justin Krzyzanowski was conducting business. Specifically, the kind of business where two parties meet at a location, something changes hands, a number is agreed upon, and both people leave in different directions as efficiently as possible. He had his phone. He had his associate. He had the items. The transaction was proceeding. And then, without input from Krzyzanowski, without warning, without any conscious participation on his part, his pocket made a decision. His phone, in his pocket, during the transaction, dialed 911. Not a misdial to a contact, not a pocket call to a friend who would hear background noise and hang up. 911. The line that is always staffed. The line that records from the moment it connects. The line that does not hang up until it understands what is happening. The dispatcher heard everything. The quantities. The prices. The specific vocabulary that circulates in conversations people prefer not to have within earshot of anyone with professional obligations. The dispatcher stayed on the line and shared the contents of the call with the people whose job is to respond to exactly that kind of information. Police arrived at the location. Krzyzanowski was arrested. The items were recovered. His associate had at some point during the preceding minutes made a more informed decision about where to be. There is a feature on every smartphone made in the last 15 years called a lock screen. It takes 4 seconds to activate. It costs nothing. It makes pocket calls to emergency services impossible. Justin Krzyzanowski would like you to know this feature exists. The Helpful Fire Department. 1996. Frederick, Maryland. In the summer of 1996, a man's shed caught fire. This is not a criminal matter. Sheds catch fire. Wood burns. It happens. The correct response when your shed is on fire is to call 911, which he did. which was the right call, and which is where things became complicated. The fire department arrived. They deployed resources. They put out the fire. The shed was saved. So far, textbook. And then they looked at what had been inside the shed. The shed had housed a substantial quantity of botanical material, the specific variety that, in Maryland, in 1996, was not available at any licensed retail location because no such locations existed anywhere in the United States. The fire had been only partially successful at its secondary unintended function. What remained was more than sufficient. 60 days. That is what saving his shed cost him. He called the fire department to protect his investment. The fire department arrived, preserved part of it, and then the rest of the situation was handed to professionals with a different set of responsibilities. Every participant in this story did exactly what they were supposed to do. The fire department, the investigators followed the evidence. He was the only person involved who had not fully thought through what the arrival of the fire department would include. The live audience. 2024. There is a principle in legal practice, fairly well established, that the evidence you provide against yourself carries particular weight. There is a second principle, apparently less widely distributed, that streaming yourself committing a federal offense on a platform with a record button is inadvisable. Ashton Connor Garcia had not encountered the second principle. In 2024, Garcia made a call, the specific type where you fabricate a violent situation at an innocent person's address and report it to emergency services, causing armed officers to appear at that person's home. While making this call, Garcia was live on Discord, camera on, microphone on, explaining to an audience in real time what he was doing and why. The investigation did not require extended reconstruction. The evidence had been broadcast at the time of the offense. Investigators did not have to piece together what happened. They had the footage. The audience had the footage. Multiple members of the audience had shared the footage before the investigation had formally begun. Garcia was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The sentencing coverage was available on the same platforms where his audience had watched the original stream. Some of them may have clipped it. The volume problem. Multiple states. Documented across years, there are people who do something once, recognize it as a mistake, and make different decisions going forward. Mir Islam was not this type of person. Islam conducted more than 50 documented operations, fabricating emergencies at specific addresses and directing armed response teams to those addresses. More than 50, across multiple years, against politicians, public figures, and media personalities. One of those addresses belonged to Michelle Obama. At some moment in a sequence of more than 50 incidents, the question stops being whether this will catch up with you. The question is only when. The when arrived. Islam was identified, arrested, and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. 2 years for more than 50 addresses. 2 years for a campaign that included, at one specific point, the home address of the First Lady of the United States. The per-incident math works out favorably if you choose to look at it from that angle. Federal prosecutors chose not to look at it from that angle. 2 years was the result regardless. The wrong number. 1997. San Diego, California. In 1997 in San Diego, a man was attempting to call Mexico. He did not call Mexico. He called 911. These are different calls. They produce different outcomes. The call connected. The dispatcher answered. The dispatcher heard a man describing a shipment, quantities, logistics, timing, the vocabulary of coordinating the movement of a large amount of product from one location to another. The dispatcher recognized that this was not a conventional emergency report, and also recognized that it was, professionally speaking, extremely useful information. Police traced the call. They found the address. They found 42 pounds of the product being discussed, the shipment that had been narrated in detail to the people best positioned to intercept it, by the person responsible for it. He was trying to reach Mexico. He reached a federally maintained emergency line, staffed around the clock, that records every word spoken during every call. The difference between his intended recipient and his actual recipient was, at minimum, 42 pounds and a substantial portion of the years ahead of him. Some numbers are more consequential than others. 911 has been in operation since 1968 and has never once behaved like a private line. The reporter. 2015, Connecticut and surrounding states, Matthew Tolis made bomb threats, multiple locations, multiple calls, a coordinated effort across New England over a period of time. This required planning. It required repeated contact with emergency dispatch services across multiple states. It also required, at some point, calling 911 to report the bomb threats he had personally made. This is the part that needs a moment. What he observed, the calls were analyzed, the pattern was identified. The voice on the threat calls and the voice on the report calls were compared. They matched. Tolis was arrested in Connecticut in 2015 and sentenced to 1 year in federal prison. He got the observation he was looking for. He watched the full response from the closest possible vantage point, which turned out to be handcuffs. 1 year for the threats, the reports, and the decision to personally watch what he had put into motion. The invented crime. 2024, Houston, Texas. In 2024 in Houston, Texas, a woman called 911 to report a carjacking. She described it in detail. The vehicle, the perpetrators, the location, the timeline. Emergency services deployed resources appropriate to a carjacking in progress, which is the correct response when a carjacking is reported. The investigation began. Investigators are professionally trained to gather evidence, identify inconsistencies, and reconstruct what actually happened. They did this. Inconsistencies appeared. Then more inconsistencies. The vehicle had not been taken. The described perpetrators did not exist. The timeline was incompatible with the physical evidence at the scene. The carjacking had not occurred. She had called 911 to report a crime she had invented. The resources dispatched to a fabricated carjacking are resources not dispatched to an actual emergency somewhere else. This is the legal theory behind the charge she received. Filing a false police report. 911 responds to what it is told. What it is told becomes a matter of record. The record, in this case, did not match the world. The complaint. Ohio. A man in Ohio had a problem. Something belonging to him had been taken. Stolen, he believed, by someone he knew. He wanted it back. He assessed his options and reached a conclusion. Law enforcement could help. Specifically, 911. He called, he reported the theft, he described the missing item. He provided all the contextual information a person provides when they want police assistance recovering stolen property. The item was botanical material of the specific variety that, in Ohio at the time of the call, was not legal to possess in the quantity he described, or in any quantity. Officers arrived. They took a report. They also made an arrest. The report concerned the stolen item. The arrest concerned the person who had just described, in detail, an illegal quantity of an illegal substance that had been in his possession until someone took it. The stolen property was not recovered. The person who had reported it was. There is a constitutional amendment, the 5th, specifically designed to protect people from providing information that damages their own case. It must be invoked by the person it protects. It does not self-activate. It does not in particular place calls to emergency services on your behalf. The report. The one that requires the least commentary. The 10th case is the one where the facts are already doing all the work, and additional language would only get in the way. A person called 911. They reported that people at an address were no longer in a condition to be helped. They provided the address. They provided a description of what had happened. Investigators arrived at the address. The scene was consistent with the call, in that the report of people being beyond help was accurate. What was not consistent was the account the caller had provided of how things had arrived at that condition. The physical evidence contradicted the caller's version of events. When the account does not match the evidence, and the account came from the person who filed the report, Investigators become very interested in speaking with that person. That person had already provided their voice on the recording, their approximate location at the time of the call, the timeline, the specific way a person talks when they are describing something they were not surprised to find. They called 911 to report the situation. The situation, as it turned out, included them. 10 calls, 10 conversations with emergency services that ended differently than any of the callers intended. Here is what connects all 10. The number works. 911 is extraordinarily effective at its actual job, which is dispatching resources to a location and creating a permanent record of everything said during the call. The recording part turned out to be relevant in several of these cases. The dispatching part was relevant in all of them. Emergency services do not evaluate whether you should have called before they respond. They respond. They arrive. They assess the situation as they find it, which sometimes includes finding the person who thought making the call was a good idea. If anything in your current situation seems like the type of thing that might not improve with the immediate arrival of law enforcement, the Fifth Amendment predates 911 by 177 years. It requires no phone call. It costs nothing. It leaves no recording. 10 cases. 10 people who found out the hard way that the system was working exactly as designed. If this was useful, or if it made you think twice, subscribe. We are apparently not done finding these.